morning, everybody. I trust you can all hear and that the sound system is working. This is, for me, really a great delight and an honor. I have to say that from the beginning of the Gilded Age project, we've really been exposed to an embarrassment of riches. It's been simply wonderful to learn so much more about the breadth and diversity, the great skill, the artistry, and the engineering of the Victorian and Edwardian Glaswegians, and also to enjoy events such as this in a range of superb interiors. Just before we began, I managed to sneak briefly upstairs and to take a look at some of the windows, because I have to confess, although my family lived for many years until 1986, my Scottish family, at number 3 Belmont Crescent, and this church, this fine, beautiful neo-Gothic church by John Honeyman, was just around the corner. This is actually the first time I've been in it. And much as with the Cottier Theatre, where one is exposed to extraordinary artistic work, above this temporary ceiling, there's a similar situation. So the learning about Glasgow's architecture, the ability to experience different buildings that have significant examples, this great expansion of knowledge that is taking place through the Gilded Age project, I find extremely welcoming and uplifting. And so, first of all, I want to thank, on behalf of us all, the wonderful people at the Glasgow City Heritage Trust, Torsten, Karen, Rachel, Erin, all their colleagues who've put out so much work to make events like this happen. I mentioned my family being from Glasgow's West End. My great-grandfather was a grocer, a well-doing man in his day, and he lived in Belmont Crescent. I think much too grand to attend this church. I think they were all people who went to the cathedral. So maybe they never came in here either. But nonetheless, this is a part of the city one feels a great affiliation with. And there's also close links too in terms of the situation in my family and that of the Webster family. We all know, of course, the tragic story of Alf Webster attending Glasgow School of Art and then being cut down in his prime in the First World War. And from Robin, we'll hear more of that shortly, and also about Gordon Webster, of course. My Scottish great-grandfather, a young man in his late teens, was conscripted into the First World War, blown up, buried alive, and dug out. And he was one of the lucky ones, I suppose. He was shell-shocked, and he was never really properly able to hold down a job. And when one thinks at this time, a century later, time of remembrance, of all the great Glaswegians who were lost in that conflict, it really is tragic. Fortunately, in this church, a large part of Alf Webster's stained glass work survives, and shortly, hopefully, we'll be able to enjoy it and the building in fully restored form. I'm going to now introduce Karen Mailley-Watt, who's really a force of nature, a great driving force that makes events like this, who makes events like this happen, and really all I can say is I'm in awe. So I hope that you enjoy today. I'm sure that just as with the last conference at the Cottier, we're going to leave enriched and thrilled and delighted with what we've heard. And so thank you very much indeed, Karen, and welcome everybody, and I hope you have a splendid day.
Okay, so firstly, thank you very much to Bruce for that lovely welcome. And I would like to say a huge thank you to Robin, Martin, and David Webster for their time and patience with my numerous and time-consuming questions. I would also like to thank Gordon Urquhart for kickstarting my interest in Alf via his wonderful book, A Notable Ornament, which, here comes the plug, you can buy over there for $14.99. I must say before I start that I am just the warm-up act, as the main entertainment starts after my slot. My talk today will fall into 3 parts, firstly focusing on Mr. Alf Webster, his creative output from 1910 to 1914, and a very, very brief section on his possible design sources. Matt, can I get the next slide, please? Okay, so this handsome chap is Alfred Alexandra Webster, who was born on the 19th of December 1883 at 40 Keir Street in Pollokshields. He was born to shipbroker George Webster and Jane McCall. A true Southsider, he not only went to Albert Road Academy in Pollokshields, but also attended Pollokshields Parish Church on the corner of Albert Drive and Shields Road. The church did have an array of stunning Stephen Adam windows, which may have sparked Alf's interest in design, and in particular stained glass, but more on that later. Next slide, please. Okay, so less than a year after marrying Maud Caroline Murdoch Cochrane in 1902, Alf registered for evening classes at the Glasgow School of Art. He took a variety of courses, including architectural modelling and stained glass, later switching to drawing and painting. But it was the study of stained glass and the creation of stained glass windows which would eventually hold his attention. Interestingly, Webster attended stained glass classes held by Stephen Adam Jr. However, it is difficult to gauge Alf's artistic development during his time at GSA, as there is little known documentation of his attendance at the school, other than an incomplete record of his courses and tutors. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we want to truly understand Webster's creative progression from architectural student to master stained glass designer, we must look at his time at the Stephen Adams studio. According to Stephen Adams' obituary, Webster left his position as a shipbroker's clerk at his father's company in 1903 to join Adam at his studio. If we look at this slide, you can see it's from the Webster archive, and we can see that Alf has created his own logo, the A and the W at the top right on the first image. And Stephen Adam has actually signed off the booklet, bottom left of the second image. Over the 7 years working with Adam, Alf made a rapid ascent from apprentice to prominent figure within the studio and worked on a variety of works, including Ayleth Parish Church in 1905, North Berwick Parish and Trinity Church, both in 1908. Next slide, please. Adam and Webster worked closely together throughout the 7 years, and it does seem that Webster became an almost surrogate son to Adam. In 1909, Webster became a partner in the Stephen Adam & Co. studio. When Adam died in 1910, he controversially overlooked his son, Stephen Adam Jr., and left the studio to Alf, but that is a whole other story. So, with the outbreak of war, Alf enlisted in the 3rd Reserve Battalion of the Gordon Highlanders in February 1915, and he received his probationary commission of 2nd Lieutenant in March. By June, Alf had reassigned to the 1st Battalion of the Gordon Highlanders and was sent to the front line. 2 months after being sent to fight at the front, Alf was wounded on patrol duty and on the 16th of August 1915 and 8 days later died of his wounds. Next slide, please. Okay, so the creative output. This is the bit that I'm really interested in. Although only covering 4 to 5 years, Alf did produce many windows, and I'll try to give you a brief overview of the catalogue of works known from 1910 to 1914. I'll take you on a whirlwind tour of some of the most prominent and also some of my favourite windows from around Scotland. During this section, however, I will not discuss the iconography or symbolism contained within the windows, as I do believe that further research has to be undertaken before a full scholarly discussion can take place. Nor will I manage to discuss his whole body of known works. I'll work through them chronologically from 1910 till 1914. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first one we have up here is Christ's Birth, Death and Resurrection from New Kilpatrick Church in 1910. And as you can see, it's from the Adams studio. So, for most of you, I don't know if you know New Kilpatrick, but it's in Bearsden. And on first glance, it could be seen as a purely Adam-esque window. But if you look on closer inspection, the Roman soldier in the far right light, you can see a bit of Alf's influence in the face. And also note the very Stephen Adam-esque colour palette of warm yellows, oranges and browns, and that there was only subtle hints of blended blues and purples. Also, the figures look quite flat and 2D in nature. Next slide, please. Okay, again, this is New Kilpatrick Church from 1910, and it's entitled The Master of Waves. The window is dedicated to John Douglas, who died and was buried at sea, again in 1910. A very fitting window indeed. I have a feeling that this window was produced slightly later in 1910, as the glass techniques seem to be slightly freer with the introduction of small faceted white jewels around the cloud above Christ's head. it does seem that there has been some experimentation with the types of glasses. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is Leocrop Church, dating from 1911, and it was gifted by Lawrence Puller. And now we're starting to see Alf cramming in more detail into his windows. Again, note the lack of warm tones for a cooler palette. And it's almost as if he has used different glass techniques and more stylistic faces to create the otherworldly figures, clearly distinguishing the celestial from the mere mortals. Keep a lookout for the two angels in the central lights, as they will appear later on. Next slide, please. Okay. This one is entitled The Good Life and is dedicated to the husband of Mrs. St. Ninian Glen, who died in 1912. There's a couple of details just to show you how much is crammed into these windows. So if you look at the textiles, the beautiful, I'm guessing it's a silk, embroidered silk, he's managed to depict in that gentleman's robe. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, as you may be aware, this window was in this building, Lansdowne Church, now Webster's Theatre, dates from 1913. And if you keep in mind the first slide I showed you, and now look at this one, it's went a bit mad with the colour palette and also the amount of detail. Sadly, I couldn't get a slide that would depict the window in its entirety because some of the detail is lost here. But I'm sure David Robertson will tell you more about this later. Next slide, please. Okay, again, this one is actually still in situ in this church, Lansdowne, now Webster's Theatre, dating from 1913. Again, I'm guessing David will probably discuss this later on, so I will just brush over it. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, forgot about this one. Interestingly, Lansdowne Church is depicted in the window that is upstairs, and it's quite nice. And I've just put this wee fish in. This is minuscule, this wee fish, and it's in the border. So it's just, again, to show how precise he was with his detail. Next slide, please. Okay, this one is my favourite, and I think David Robertson has said it's his favourite as well. It's entitled Prayer and Praise, and it's in New Kilpatrick Church, dated from 1914. And remember the angels I was telling you about from Leocrop Church in the previous slide? Well, here they are again, slightly different. This window is dedicated to Mr. Johnston and his parents and her sister, who died in 1905, and he was an elder at New Kilpatrick Church. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a detail of Prayer and Praise. Again, just to show the amount of detail that is actually within the windows. In the border, again, he seems to love to put different wee hidden motifs or a wee nod to Glasgow in his borders. So there's Glasgow Cathedral. Again, it's minuscule in the border, but it's just to show you because probably not everyone's seen these windows. Next slide, please. Again, Prayer and Praise. She does actually have a tiny wee praying figure in her robes. So if you do get a chance to look at Alf's windows at any point in this church, then please do look out for the different motifs that he has hidden throughout. Next slide, please. Okay, Marion Bell Memorial window, Cadder Church, Parish Church, 1914. The window is in memory of Marion Bell, who was the wife of locomotive engineer Sir Hugh Reid. And if you note the tiny wee bell motif, which is actually in the window. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we look at the Cadder window and the New Kilpatrick windows, you can clearly see that some of the design has been used for both. There is only a couple of slight differences. So on the left-hand side, we've got Cadder Parish Church, and on the right, we've got New Kilpatrick. So just a couple of things to point out. The textile that's over her shoulder, she's got hints of white here, but not here. And up top right, her hands are slightly bigger than the one on the left. But it is just to show that this was produced in the same year, 1914, so he may have just been working on both at the same time. Who knows? Next slide, please. Okay, this one is in Linlithgow, and it's actually quite interesting. The window is dedicated to Reverend George Ferguson, who was minister at the parish church for 35 years, and it depicts both historical and saintly figures. Next slide, please. Okay, so working from left to right, this is on the top row, we have St. Ninian, who is saint of Scottish church builders, to whom there is a dedicated altar in St. Michael's. St. Michael, who is Prince of Celestial Armies and the patron saint of the church and the borough, St. Bridget, and then St. Andrew. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the historical figures depicted within the Lithgow window. First we have King James IV, and then we have Queen Victoria, whose reign the restoration of the church took place. Next slide, please. Ooh. Okay, this window actually demonstrates clearly Alf's multiple talents as an artist, as not only is he exceptional at portraiture painting, but he is also very skilled at accurately depicting the built environment. If we look closely enough, we can see many, many buildings within that window. But if we zoom in to Queen Victoria, and on the bottom right of her feet, she's got St Michael's Parish Church, which is in Lithgow, and it's obviously the window is in that church. And you can see how closely he's managed to scale and depict the church. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is just a last one, again, to show you the different types of colours and the contrasts he used throughout his windows. This is the Reverend James Memorial Window, Cadder Church, 1914. And Reverend James Watt was the minister at Cadder from 1882 to 1911, and the window was gifted by the congregation and friends. So next slide, please. Okay, so quickly I'd like to discuss where Alf may have gotten some of his design sources. It does seem that, like many designers and artists, Alf took inspiration from the world around him, most notably his family. On the screen just now is a wonderful photograph of Maud and her son Gordon Webster. Before moving on, I'd like to quickly mention how strong a character Maud Webster must have been, as it seems that Maud managed to keep the studio going through the war and after. As Gordon Urquhart points out, Maud's name does appear in the directories associated with the Adams studio up until the end of the 1920s. Keep in mind that she did have 3 very young children to bring up. The small boy sitting next to Maud is Gordon Webster, future stained glass artist, who we will hear more about from Robin Webster later on. Upon gathering the information for the conference, I realised that Gordon appears throughout Webster's work, most notably as a small angel in Stephen Adams' memorial window, First Fruits, which is in New Kilpatrick Church. Matching the dates, it does seem that Gordon was aged 3 when Webster designed First Fruits. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are just a couple of details of First Fruits. So we've got Gordon's head, we've got Alf Webster's signature just at the top of the wings, and then we've got the dedication to Stephen Adam just at the bottom. Next slide, please. Okay, so however, Gordon does reappear in a smaller version in a window in Shettleston Old Church dating from 1913. I've just tried to highlight him here because it is quite a big window and it might have been lost. Next slide, please. Okay, it is possible that Alf used Gordon again as a life model when Gordon was slightly older. If we look at a close-up from Cadder Parish Church of the Reverend James Watt Memorial window, we can clearly see a small boy in roughly the same bowed position as the young boy in First Fruits. Next slide, please. Again, if we look at the Templeton window in Lansdowne, now Webster's Theatre, we can see a boy aged about 7 or 8 standing before Christ. If this is the case, Gordon appears twice in the Lansdowne windows as he appears as a younger, chubbier child in the McCowan window. Next slide, please. It does seem that Gordon Webster isn't the only life model Webster used. When I was looking through the Webster archive, it became apparent that Alf may have used his brother Edward Webster in some of his windows. Although currently speculation, there is a striking likeness to some of Alf's sketches labelled Edward and the faces in the windows. Next slide, please. Again, Webster has not labelled this sketch, but there's no doubt in my mind that this could be Edward from a different angle. The one thing that's making me think this is the noses, but I could be wrong. Next slide, please. Okay, this beautiful sketch, I do believe, is the inspiration for this window, which is in Lansdowne Church. But without further research, it is currently just speculation, as I say. But I'll leave it with you for you to decide. Next slide, please. Just to round things off, I've managed to pull together, I think it's about 22 windows of Alf's known works between 1910 and 1914. So feel free just to come and ask me if you want a copy of this. I'm happy to give you it. Next slide, please. And again, as you can see, runs right through 1913, 1914, and there is a couple of unknown dates. But if anybody knows of any other windows, please do let me know. But I do encourage you to go out and experience the windows yourself. Next slide, please. Thank you very much.